Today, we are opening up what might just be the literal ultimate historical mystery box. We're embarking on a completely impartial, intensely focused investigation into one of the most debated, scrutinized, and absolutely baffling artifacts in human history, the Shroud of Turin. Whether you're approaching this from a place of deep faith, rigorous scientific skepticism, or honestly just pure historical curiosity, the Shroud presents a puzzle that has quite literally stumped some of the greatest minds for centuries. So we're going to break down the simple story of the Shroud's historical journey, we'll examine exactly what the modern scientific evidence actually says about its claimed links to Jesus of Nazareth, and we'll ask the biggest question of all: can this remarkable cloth ever be definitively proven either true or false? Let's get into it. Just think about the sheer visual anomaly of the image itself. This isn't just some faint, messy stain on an old piece of fabric. What we have here is a haunting, highly detailed image of a face, and actually a full body, that possesses the exact properties of a photographic negative. I mean, really think about that for a second. We're talking about a piece of ancient linen that features a perfect negative image hundreds of years before the concept of photography was even a thing. It's this specific, entirely inexplicable characteristic that transformed the Shroud from a simple religious relic into a global scientific obsession. Seriously, how does a photographic negative end up on an ancient piece of cloth? Okay, before we get swept up in the wild theories and the heated debates, let's just anchor ourselves in the tangible, verifiable facts. Here are the physical characteristics of the artifact itself. It's a linen sheet, measuring just over 14 feet long and nearly 4 feet wide. It contains a double monochromatic image showing both the front and the back of a man who clearly appears to have suffered severe physical trauma, consistent with crucifixion. But here are the two absolute most crucial physical facts. First, tests have definitively confirmed that the red marks on the cloth are actual real blood stains containing human hemoglobin and serum albumin. And second, and this is the part that really baffles experts, the image itself completely lacks traditional pigments, paints, or dyes. There are literally no brush strokes to be found here. Section 1. The Medieval Paper Trail. Let's trace those historical origins. To really understand the Shroud, we have to ask a very basic historical question. How far back can we actually trace its paper trail? Well, the very first verified, absolutely indisputable historical appearance of this specific cloth happens in the 1350s in a small village called Lirey in France. From there, it goes on quite a journey. In 1502, it's moved to Chambéry, France, and then finally, in 1578, the Duke of Savoy moves across the Alps to Turin, Italy. And the reason for that 1578 move is actually fascinating. It was brought to Turin specifically to shorten the grueling pilgrimage of Cardinal Charles Borromeo, who was literally walking on foot to venerate the cloth after surviving a plague. The intense, unwavering devotion this object inspired was just unparalleled. But here is where we hit a massive historical roadblock. 14 centuries of silence. Impartially speaking, this is the skeptic's absolute strongest argument. There is no verified, continuous historical documentation linking the burial cloth mentioned in the first-century Gospels to the cloth that suddenly popped up in France in the 1350s. That is a historical void of over 1,400 years. Now, proponents of the Shroud will point to legends of earlier cloths in Edessa or Constantinople, but a definitive, unbroken paper trail, it simply does not exist. Moving on to Section 2, the scientific scrutiny. What happens when the Shroud meets the modern lab? That 1,400-year historical gap basically pushed the Shroud from the altar straight to the laboratory. In 1978, the Vatican allowed international experts, a group known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, unprecedented access to the cloth. For 120 continuous hours, they basically threw every piece of modern technology they had at this linen. And what they found was stunning. They confirmed, again, no paints or dyes were used to create the image. Instead, the image was caused by a mysterious, rapid oxidation and dehydration of the very top microfibrils of the linen itself. But the biggest shock? That came when they fed photographs of the Shroud into a VP8 image analyzer, a device literally used by NASA. The analyzer revealed that the image contains incredibly precise 3D topographical distance data,
A normal painting or photograph will distort completely in a VP8, but the Shroud? It mapped out a perfect three-dimensional human form.
Section 3. The radiocarbon dating dispute. The plot absolutely thickens.
So after those 1978 tests, many people felt science had proven the Shroud wasn't a medieval forgery, mostly because medieval artists simply didn't have the technology to encode 3D data or oxidize microscopic fibers. But science is rarely ever settled that easily. Exactly 10 years later, we hit an absolute deadlock. On one side, we have the 1978 STRP findings, unexplainable chemical oxidation, authentic blood, encoded 3D spatial data. But on the other side, we have 1988. In 1988, 3 totally independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona performed carbon-14 dating on a tiny corner of the Shroud. The results were unanimous. The linen dated to between the years 1260 and 1390. According to the C14 dating, the cloth was definitively a product of the Middle Ages. Case closed, right? Actually, scratch that. It didn't close the book at all. Syndenologists, those are the dedicated researchers who study the Shroud, fiercely rejected the 1988 radiocarbon dating. They argued that the sample taken was just inherently flawed. Because the Shroud survived a devastating church fire in 1532 and was handled by thousands of people over the centuries, they theorized the test sample was totally contaminated. Some suggest a microscopic bioplastic coating skewed the carbon levels, while others point out that the sample was taken from an outer edge that was secretly repaired by nuns in the Middle Ages. If that's true, it means the labs accurately dated a 14th century patch, not the original 1st century cloth.
So this begs the ultimate question. If the skeptics and the 1988 carbon-14 tests are right, and this wasn't a 1st century burial cloth, how on earth was it made? I mean, if a medieval forger created this, they somehow managed to create a chemically oxidized photographic negative with 3D data encoded right into it, using real human blood, all without using a single drop of paint. How? Let's take a look at a few of the replication theories.
Let's start with the case for a medieval mastermind. Art historian Nicholas Allen proposed that the Shroud is actually the world's very first photograph. He theorized that a brilliant medieval inventor used a primitive quartz crystal lens to focus sunlight into a dark room. Inside that room, a linen cloth was coated with photosensitive chemicals that were actually available at the time, like silver nitrate. By leaving a mannequin suspended in the sun outside for several days, the image was slowly burned onto the cloth. It's a fascinating theory for sure, and it really attempts to explain that mind-bending photographic negative aspect. Other scientists, though, have taken a distinctly modern, high-tech approach to cracking this. Researchers at Italy's NAA laboratory utilized excimer lasers to emit incredibly short pulses of vacuum ultraviolet light onto linen. And they actually successfully managed to replicate the precise superficial yellowing of the Shroud's microfibrils. But here is the catch. To reproduce the entire image of the Shroud with a single flash of this light would require an estimated 14,000 lasers firing simultaneously. It absolutely shows the incredible burst of energy required to make the image, but it certainly doesn't explain how someone pulled that off in the year 1350. So perhaps the answer is way lower tech. Skeptics often point to the frottage and bas-relief theory. This basically involves taking a linen sheet, placing it over a shallow carved 3D statue, a bas-relief, and then rubbing the cloth with acidic substances or mild pigments. Think of it kind of like taking a crayon and rubbing it over a piece of paper on top of a coin. This rubbing technique, frottage, would naturally transfer the 3D characteristics of the statue onto the cloth, which perfectly accounts for that topographic data found by the NASA VP8 analyzer back in 1978.
And skeptics make a really compelling point here regarding the historical context. During the 14th century in Gothic France, there was an intense religious focus on the physical suffering of Christ alongside these highly macabre, incredibly realistic depictions of corpses in art. To a historian, the anatomical style of the man on the Shroud fits perfectly within this artistic era. They argue that the Shroud appears exactly when and exactly where you would expect a brilliant Gothic artistic relic to be produced.
Which brings us to Section 4, Science, Faith, and Proof, the ultimate mystery. So we have forensic anomalies that completely defy medieval technology, directly clashing with carbon dating and historical timelines that place it squarely in the 14th century. We are basically standing at a crossroads. It actually reminds me of this incredible quote from the pioneering scientist Louis Pasteur. "A little science estranges men from God, but much science leads them back to him." The Shroud exists at the absolute intersection of empirical, hard science and deeply held spiritual belief. For some, those scientific anomalies are mathematical proof of a miraculous resurrection. For others, it's proof of an incredibly clever, yet entirely earthly, historical forgery.
So what is the actual takeaway for us here? Well, it is this. The definitive answer currently resides strictly in the realm of faith, or in unverified scientific theory. We have to acknowledge the absolute limits of our current science. To this day, no one has ever been able to definitively prove the shroud is a first-century miracle. But equally, no laboratory in the world has ever been able to perfectly replicate a one-to-one copy of the shroud with all of its exact optical, physical, and chemical characteristics. It remains undefeated by definitive proof on either side.
Which leaves us with the ultimate mystery box. If modern science cannot perfectly replicate it, and historians cannot definitively trace it back to its source, what does the Shroud of Turin mean to you? Is it the miraculous physical echo of the resurrection? Is it the greatest, most technologically baffling art forgery in human history? Or is it something else entirely?